An FBI agent vanished, investigating a shadowy syndicate. 4 years later, a storage unit unearths his hidden torture chamber and a cryptic warning. The real enemy was already inside the bureau, and his secrets could burn it all down. The stale metallic tang of disuse hung heavy in the air of the secure store facility, a scent that did little to mask the underlying current of nervous energy radiating from Detective Lisa Park. It was August 1991, 4 long years since FBI Special Agent Richard Monroe had vanished into the humid Washington, D.C. ether, leaving behind a meticulously tidy apartment and a case file on an unnamed syndicate that had been his obsession. 4 years of silence, of dead ends, until now. Agent Tom Reynolds, his FBI credentials a stark contrast to Park's local police badge, jiggled the key in the stubborn lock of Unit 387. The anonymous tip, phoned into Park's precinct by a distorted voice, had been frustratingly vague. Monroe, secure store, Unit 387. Look deeper. Deeper than what? The unit was registered under a shell corporation that had dissolved 3 years prior, its payments automatically debited from an account that had simultaneously gone dormant. The lock finally clicked, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet of the corridor. Reynolds, a man whose patience was as legendary as his coffee consumption, grunted and heaved the corrugated metal door upwards. It protested with a screech that made Park wince, revealing a space crammed with the mundane detritus of a forgotten life. Dusty furniture draped in white sheets, stacks of yellowing newspapers, sealed cardboard boxes labeled kitchen or books. Nothing immediately screamed missing FBI agent. Smells like mothballs and disappointment, Reynolds muttered, his gaze methodically sweeping the 10 by 20 foot space. He was younger than Park, with a sharpness to his features that hadn't yet been softened by years of bureaucratic attrition. He'd been a rookie when Monroe went missing, but the legend of the senior agent loomed large in bureau lore. Park, however, felt a prickle of unease that went beyond the musty odor. Her eyes, accustomed to spotting the out-of-place in domestic disputes and robbery scenes, snagged on the back wall. It looked too flat, too uniform compared to the slightly dented, scuffed walls of the neighboring units she'd glimpsed. "Tom," she said, her voice low, "that back wall, does it look right to you?" Reynolds joined her, his own brow furrowing. He ran a hand along its smooth, painted surface. "It's newer than the rest of the unit," he observed. No scuffs, no grime in the seams. He rapped his knuckles against it. Instead of the expected metallic clang of the facility's construction, there was a dull, almost solid thud. He rapped again, harder. "That's not sheet metal. That's wood, or drywall, built inside the unit." They exchanged a look. "Look deeper," the voice had said. Standard procedure would involve warrants, a specialized team. But the tip had been specific, the connection to Monroe too potent to ignore. Reynolds pulled a heavy-duty multi-tool from his belt. "If this is what I think it is," he began, then set to work prying at a barely visible seam near the floor. Park shone her flashlight onto his hands, the beam dancing with dust motes. The paneling creaked, then groaned. With a final wrench, Reynolds pulled a section of the false wall away, revealing not the expected metal beyond, but darkness. A different kind of smell wafted out, acrid and faintly chemical, overlaying a cloying, almost sweetish odor that Park couldn't immediately identify but which made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It was the scent of old fear. "Get ready," Reynolds said, his voice tight. He aimed his own flashlight into the void. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating a cramped, windowless space no larger than a walk-in closet. It was a room that had no business being there, a secret chamber carved out of the anonymous landscape of forgotten belongings. The walls were padded, not with soundproofing material for a budding musician, but with thick, dark, industrial foam that looked like it could swallow screams whole. In the center of the room, bolted to the concrete floor, was a single stark metal chair. Heavy leather restraints, stained and stiff, hung from its arms and legs. On the floor beside it lay a discarded length of rubber hose and a small rusted bucket. Park felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't just a hidden room, it was a purpose-built cage, a place of torment. "Oh my God," she whispered, the words barely audible. Reynolds was already stepping carefully inside, his light playing over the grim tableau. He crouched, his attention fixed on something metallic glinting near the base of the chair. He picked it up gingerly. It was an FBI badge, Monroe's badge, the eagle emblem tarnished, the photo ID beneath the plastic facing scratched but still recognizable. Richard Monroe, his official portrait exuding a confidence that felt like a cruel mockery in this setting. The clip on the back was bent, as if it had been ripped from clothing. Park's gaze was drawn to a series of faint, desperate scratches on the padded wall behind the chair, almost hidden in the dark material. They looked like fingernail marks, a frantic tally of days, or perhaps something else entirely, a message that couldn't be deciphered. Then she saw it, a small, dark stain on the padding, just at head height for someone seated in the chair, another on the floor. Her stomach churned. No overt signs of remains, Reynolds stated, his voice carefully neutral, professional, but Park could hear the underlying shock. But this place, he trailed off, running a gloved hand over the chillingly smooth surface of a restraint. This was an interrogation room, a black site, right in the middle of suburbia. 4 years, Park said, the words heavy with the weight of that silence. He could have been here for days, weeks. She didn't want to complete the thought. The implications were horrifying. Monroe, the seasoned agent, subjected to this. On a small, makeshift shelf crudely affixed to one wall, a single item sat, a cheap plastic alarm clock, its display frozen at 3:17. AM or PM, it was impossible to tell. Was it the time he was taken? The time he left? Or simply the moment the batteries had died? A random cessation in a place where time itself must have warped and twisted. Beside the clock was a worn, leather-bound journal. Monroe's? Park's heart hammered. Reynolds carefully bagged the badge and then reached for the journal, his movements precise. He opened it, and Park leaned in, her light joining his. The first few pages were filled with neat, meticulous handwriting, case notes, observations, dates, Monroe's investigation. But then the writing changed. It became erratic, sprawling, the pen strokes deep and angry, then faint and spidery. Dates disappeared, replaced by disjointed phrases, names she didn't recognize, and chilling, almost childlike drawings of eyes, hundreds of watching eyes. He was alive in here, Reynolds breathed. He was conscious. He was writing. The final entry was a single stark sentence, scrawled diagonally across the page, almost illegible. They don't know about the canary. Canary? What canary? The discovery of the hidden room, the chair, the badge, the journal. It was a maelstrom. It answered the question of where Monroe had been taken, but it ripped open a universe of new, more terrifying questions. Who were they? What information did they believe Monroe possessed that was worth this elaborate, brutal setup? And what, in God's name, was the canary? The silence of Unit 387, once merely stale, now felt pregnant with unspoken horrors. The ordinary objects in the outer storage area, the dusty furniture, the sealed boxes, seemed to mock them with their normality, silent witnesses to the nightmare concealed just feet away. Richard Monroe had not just vanished. He had been swallowed by a darkness hidden in plain sight, a darkness that had operated with impunity for 4 long years. And the key to understanding it, perhaps even to finding him or what was left of him, might lie in the desperate scribblings of a broken man and a cryptic reference to a bird. The investigation, ice-cold for years, had just been thrown into a raging fire. Richard Monroe had been more than just a name on a missing person poster, or a ghost haunting the corridors of the FBI's Hoover building. He was, by all accounts, an institution unto himself, a man whose quiet intensity and almost preternatural ability to connect disparate facts had made him a legend long before he reached his 41st birthday. His disappearance in the spring of 1987 hadn't just been the loss of an agent, it had been the extinguishing of a particular kind of light, a beacon of relentless, methodical justice. Monroe wasn't the flamboyant, door-kicking type of agent often glorified in fiction. His battlefield was the intricate web of evidence, his weapons a keen intellect and an unshakable patience. Colleagues remembered him as a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with a precision that cut through obfuscation like a surgeon's scalpel. He was tall, with a lean, almost ascetic build, his dark hair perpetually neat, his suits impeccably tailored but never ostentatious. His office, much like his apartment, had been a testament to his orderly mind. files arranged with geometric precision, pens aligned, not a speck of dust to be seen. It was the office of a man who believed in control, in system, in the inherent order that justice should represent. His early career had been marked by a steady rise through the ranks, tackling white-collar crime with a flair that surprised many. He could dissect a complex financial fraud with the same meticulousness he later applied to organized crime. It was in the latter, however, that he found his true grim calling. He had a particular disdain for syndicates, for the shadowy networks that preyed on the vulnerable and corrupted institutions. The case he was working on when he vanished, the investigation into an unnamed, multifaceted criminal enterprise, had consumed him. He'd spoken of it in hushed, urgent tones to his then-partner, David Sterling, hinting at a level of sophistication and ruthlessness that chilled even seasoned agents. "They're like smoke, Dave," he'd said, his usually calm grey eyes narrowed in thought. "You think you see their shape, then it shifts. But the fire beneath is real, and it's burning through everything." The loss of Richard Monroe was a multi-layered blow. Personally, for those who knew him, it was the absence of a wry, understated wit, the quiet loyalty of a friend who might not say much, but would always be there. For his colleagues, it was the gaping hole in their collective expertise. Monroe had possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of criminal methodologies, a sixth sense for a liar's tale, and an uncanny ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. Cases he had been peripherally involved in, consultations he had given, suddenly felt less secure, the threads he had been holding now frayed. More profoundly, his vanishing struck at the heart of the Bureau's image of invincibility. If an agent of Monroe's caliber, renowned for his caution and acuity, could be plucked from the streets of the nation's capital without a trace, what did that say about their ability to protect their own, let alone the citizenry? A palpable chill had descended. Agents became more circumspect, looking over their shoulders more often, the unspoken fear of a similar fate, a new, unwelcome partner in their daily grind. The investigation into the unnamed syndicate, which Monroe had tentatively labeled Noctua in his private notes, a reference to the genus of night owls, creatures of darkness and silent predation, had been his sole focus for 18 months prior to his disappearance. He'd amassed volumes of data, meticulously cross-referencing shell corporations, offshore accounts, and whispered informant testimonies. He believed Noctua was involved in everything from high-level arms trafficking and political corruption to sophisticated money laundering schemes that spanned continents. He was convinced they were not just another criminal outfit, but a cancerous growth deep within the establishment. With his disappearance, the Noctua investigation effectively imploded. His files, while voluminous, were a labyrinth without his guiding hand. Key informants, already spooked, clammed up entirely. Leads grew cold with an almost aggressive speed. It was as if a maestro had been snatched from the podium mid-symphony, leaving the orchestra in discordant chaos. The discovery in Unit 387, 4 years later, ripped the scar tissue off this old wound. The knowledge that Monroe hadn't just been disappeared but had been held, interrogated, subjected to the horrors implied by that stark room, was a fresh agony. Detective Lisa Park, too young to have known Monroe personally but steeped in the local lore of his vanishing, felt the weight of it as she and Reynolds emerged from the storage facility into the blinding August sun. The contents of the hidden room seared into their minds. The badge, the journal, these were not just evidence, they were relics of a man's final, desperate stand. The journal, in particular, was a haunting testament. Reynolds had secured it in an evidence bag, but the image of those last scrawled words, "They don't know about the canary," echoed in Park's head. What canary? A source? A piece of information so vital Monroe had clung to it even in the face of unimaginable suffering? Or was it the ramblings of a mind pushed beyond its limits? The loss of Richard Monroe also meant the loss of potential. What other major cases would he have cracked? What other criminal enterprises would he have dismantled? His career trajectory had been aimed at the Bureau's highest echelons. He was a man who could have shaped the future of federal law enforcement. Instead, his legacy was now tied to a dusty storage unit and a hidden room of horrors. His former partner, David Sterling, now a section chief, had aged visibly in the intervening years. When Park and Reynolds briefed him on their findings, his face, already etched with the lines of stress and grief, seemed to crumble. He'd always held on to a sliver of hope, however irrational, that Monroe had perhaps gone deep undercover, too deep to make contact. The reality of the torture room shattered that last, fragile defense. "Richard," Sterling had whispered, staring at the photograph of Monroe's badge, "what did they do to you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable for now. The void left by Monroe was not just in case files or manpower. It was a void in the institutional memory, a chilling reminder of the stakes. He was the agent who saw too much, dug too deep. His meticulous nature, his systematic approach, had made him a formidable foe to the underworld. And in return, that underworld had responded with a brutality that was both terrifyingly personal and chillingly efficient. As Park and Reynolds began the painstaking process of analyzing the contents of the hidden room and the journal, they weren't just investigating a missing person anymore. They were exhuming a legacy, trying to piece together the final terrifying months, weeks, or days of a brilliant mind under siege. The man he was, a dedicated servant of justice, contrasted so starkly with the brutal, undignified end hinted at by Unit 387. And the canary, whatever it was, suddenly felt like the only lifeline to understanding not just Monroe's fate, but the true nature of the enemy he had faced. The enemy that had managed to silence one of the FBI's brightest for 4 long years. The sterile environment of the FBI's Washington field office felt a universe away from the grim, fetid reality of Unit 387. Detective Lisa Park, sitting beside Agent Tom Reynolds in a conference room that smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and ambition, felt the distinct chill of institutional appraisal. Across the polished mahogany table sat Assistant Director Harrison Croft, a man whose silver hair and meticulously knotted tie seemed to reflect the Bureau's carefully constructed public image. Alongside him was Section Chief David Sterling, Monroe's former partner, his face a mask of strained composure. Reynolds had laid out the findings with stark precision: the anonymous tip, the discovery of the hidden room, the chair, the restraints, Monroe's badge, and the disturbing journal. He presented the preliminary crime scene photos, each image a cold testament to calculated brutality. Park watched Croft's eyes. They were like chips of ice, betraying nothing as he absorbed the horrific details. Sterling, in contrast, visibly flinched at the sight of the close-up of the badge, a muscle twitching in his jaw. When Reynolds finished, an uncomfortable silence descended, broken only by the distant hum of the building's HVAC system. Croft steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on the photo of the journal's final cryptic entry. "They don't know about the canary." "A disturbing discovery, Agent Reynolds." "Detective Park," Croft began, his voice smooth, measured, betraying no discernible emotion beyond a professional gravity. "The Bureau appreciates the diligence of local law enforcement in bringing this to our immediate attention." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards Park, a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than an acknowledgement. "Richard Monroe was one of our finest," Croft continued, his gaze shifting to a point somewhere over Reynolds's shoulder. "His disappearance was a significant blow. This is a deeply troubling development." Sterling finally spoke, his voice raspy. "The room, Harrison. It's a black site. Someone built a torture chamber and held one of our own there." His hands were clenched into fists on the table. "We need to pour every available resource into this. Find out who. Find out why." Croft's expression remained unchanged. "Naturally, David, we will investigate thoroughly. Agent Reynolds, you will lead the preliminary assessment team under Section Chief Sterling's oversight. Detective Park, your cooperation is, of course, valued. We'll need a full transfer of your local case files and any physical evidence recovered." It sounded standard, even supportive, yet Park felt a subtle, disquieting undercurrent. There was a coolness in Croft's demeanor, a detachment that seemed incongruous with the barbarity of the discovery. He hadn't asked about Noctua, the shadowy organization Monroe had been investigating, the very name of which was scrawled repeatedly in the early, lucid parts of the journal. "Sir," Reynolds interjected, "the journal entries, before they become incoherent, heavily reference Monroe's investigation into the syndicate he codenamed Noctua. The level of detail suggests he was close to something significant." Croft's eyes flicked down to the journal, then back to Reynolds. Agent Monroe was pursuing several complex investigations at the time of his disappearance. It would be premature to fixate on any single theory. His mental state, as evidenced by the later entries and the drawings, clearly deteriorated. We must consider the possibility that these writings are not entirely reliable. Park stiffened. With all due respect, Assistant Director, she said, her voice firm but respectful, the physical evidence of the room, the restraints, to the badge. They paint a very clear picture of a targeted abduction and brutal interrogation. The journal, reliable or not in its entirety, is the only voice Richard Monroe has left. The mention of Noctua and the Canary can't be dismissed as mere delusion until proven otherwise. A flicker of something, annoyance, crossed Croft's face before it was smoothed away. Detective, your dedication is commendable. However, the FBI has protocols, established procedures for investigations of this magnitude, particularly when they involve one of our own and potentially classified information Monroe might have possessed. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Speculation, especially to outside agencies or the media, would be unhelpful. The message was clear: control the narrative, keep it in-house. Park felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The system was already beginning to close ranks, not necessarily to find the truth, but perhaps to manage it. Over the next few days, this initial sense of unease solidified into frustrating reality. The preliminary assessment team Reynolds was assigned to lead felt more like a holding pen. Requests for specialized forensic analysis of the hidden room were met with delays, citing backlogs and resource allocation to active, high-priority cases. Access to Monroe's original Noctua case files, sealed since his disappearance, required multiple levels of clearance, each taking an inordinate amount of time. Sterling, while outwardly supportive, seemed hampered by the bureaucracy above him. In private conversations with Reynolds, his frustration was palpable. "They're slow-walking it, Tom," he'd said, pacing his office. "Croft is being cautious, overly cautious. He's worried about where the Noctua trail might lead, who it might embarrass." "Embarrass?" Reynolds had countered. "Or implicate?" Sterling had just shaken his head, the unspoken truth heavy between them. Monroe's theory about Noctua being a cancerous growth deep within the establishment suddenly felt chillingly prescient. Park, relegated to the periphery, found her attempts to collaborate met with polite but firm deflections. Her own chief, while sympathetic, had little leverage against the federal machine. She was an outsider, and the FBI seemed intent on keeping her there. The message from the distorted voice on the anonymous tip, "Look deeper," felt more pertinent than ever, but she was being systematically walled off from doing so. The journal became a particular point of contention. The Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit, after a cursory review, issued a preliminary opinion suggesting Monroe had likely suffered a psychotic break due to the stress of captivity, casting doubt on the coherence and veracity of his later writings, including the Canary reference. They focused on the erratic script and bizarre drawings, downplaying the earlier, more lucid investigative notes. "They're trying to discredit him," Park told Reynolds during a snatched, clandestine meeting in a coffee shop far from FBI headquarters. If Monroe was unstable, then anything he wrote about Noctua, anything that might point to sensitive or compromising information, can be dismissed as paranoia. Reynolds, his face grim, nodded. "They want to bury it, Lisa, or at least control what parts of it see the light of day." Croft even suggested that Monroe might have staged parts of his own disappearance, though how he squares that with a torture chamber I don't know. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound weariness. The official narrative they seem to be leaning towards is that Monroe was taken by a relatively small, isolated group, perhaps for ransom or personal revenge, and that his Noctua work was largely unrelated, a product of an overstressed mind. This was more than just indifference. It was a subtle, insidious rewriting of reality. It was the system protecting itself, perhaps from an enemy it didn't want to acknowledge, or worse, an enemy it couldn't afford to expose. The initial shock of the discovery was being carefully managed, diluted by bureaucratic procedure and strategic skepticism. The Canary was the one thread they couldn't easily dismiss or explain away. It was too specific, too out of place. They don't know about the Canary. Who were they? His captors? Or someone else? Someone Monroe believed wouldn't think to look for it, or wouldn't understand its significance. Park and Reynolds knew that if they were to uncover the truth of Richard Monroe's fate and the meaning behind his final words, they would likely have to operate outside the official channels, In the very shadows, the system seemed determined to maintain. The disappearance of Agent Monroe had been a crime. The official response to the discovery of Unit 387 was beginning to feel like something else entirely. A quiet, systematic obstruction, a chilling display of institutional self-preservation that prioritized containment over truth. The fight for Richard Monroe wasn't just against his unknown captors anymore. It was now also against the very system he had served. The official FBI investigation into the rediscovery of Richard Monroe's fate was rapidly becoming a masterclass in bureaucratic inertia. Assistant Director Croft's calm, authoritative pronouncements about due process and maintaining operational security translated into a suffocating blanket thrown over any attempt at aggressive inquiry. For Detective Lisa Park and Agent Tom Reynolds, the frustration was a palpable entity, a third unwelcome presence in their increasingly clandestine meetings. But it was David Sterling, Monroe's former partner, who felt the sting of this institutional lethargy most acutely. The memories of Richard, once sources of pride and camaraderie, now returned as bitter accusations of a system failing one of its own. Sterling found himself revisiting the 18 months leading up to Richard's disappearance, not as a section chief reviewing a cold case, but as a friend searching for a ghost. He remembered Richard's growing obsession with the Noctua Syndicate, the way it had consumed his waking hours and haunted his sleep. Monroe hadn't been prone to flights of fancy. His theories, however audacious, were always anchored by meticulous research. One evening, about a month before Monroe vanished, Sterling recalled finding him in his office late, surrounded by a chaotic array of financial statements, shipping manifests, and surveillance photos. Monroe had looked up, his eyes burning with an intensity that startled Sterling. "They're everywhere, Dave," he'd said, his voice low and urgent. "Embedded. They're not just crooks, they're puppeteers." He'd tapped a thick binder, "And I think I found one of their main strings, a place where the money and the influence converge. It's unexpected." He hadn't elaborated further that night, a reticent Sterling now cursed. This memory, coupled with the cryptic canary reference in the journal, gnawed at Sterling. Richard had always been a lover of classic spy novels, of intricate plots and hidden meanings. A canary wasn't just a bird. In espionage parlance, it was a warning, a test, something or someone sacrificial sent in to see if the air was safe. Or perhaps it was something more literal, a hidden fail-safe. Meanwhile, Park and Reynolds, stonewalled at every official turn, decided to revisit the source, Unit 387, and its disturbing contents. The FBI had sealed it, of course, but Reynolds, using his credentials and a carefully worded pretext about verifying initial chain of custody, managed to gain them a brief, supervised re-entry. The oppressive atmosphere of the hidden room was unchanged, the single chair a silent, brutal monument. This time, Park focused less on the obvious implements of torture and more on the minutiae. The scratches on the wall, the specific placement of the defunct alarm clock, the way the cheap shelf was affixed. It was Park who noticed it, a tiny discrepancy they'd overlooked in their initial shock. The alarm clock, frozen at 3:17, was a common, inexpensive brand. But beneath it, almost invisible against the dark shelf, was a faint, circular indentation in the dust, slightly larger than the clock's base. "Something else was here," she murmured, pointing. "Something round that sat here for a long time." Reynolds photographed it, but its significance remained elusive. Their most potent tool remained the journal. The Bureau's dismissal of its later entries as psychotic ramblings felt increasingly like a convenient narrative. Reynolds, with his FBI training in cryptography and analysis, and Park, with her street-smart intuition, began to re-examine every scrawl, every seemingly random drawing of an eye. What if the eyes aren't just paranoia? Park mused one late night, hunched over photocopies of the journal pages in her small apartment. What if they represent surveillance points, or people watching, or even a code? Sterling, meanwhile, tormented by his own memories and the Bureau's deliberate foot-dragging, made a decision. He couldn't openly defy Croft, but he could provide guidance. He arranged an accidental encounter with Reynolds in the building's cavernous archive room, a place rarely frequented by senior management. Richard had a peculiar system for his most sensitive informant files, Sterling said, his back to Reynolds as he ostensibly searched for an old case file. He didn't trust digital, not for the really deep stuff. He always said, "Paper has a memory, but it doesn't talk unless you make it. He had a fondness for ornithology, called his high-risk sources his rare birds, claimed it helped him compartmentalize. The word ornithology struck Reynolds like a physical blow. Birds, canaries. He used to talk about the resplendent quetzal or the silent nightingale, Sterling continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Code words. He'd brief me on the generalities, but the true identities, the actual files, he kept those separate, extremely separate. Sterling paused, then pulled a dusty, unrelated file from a shelf. He once mentioned, half-jokingly, that if anything ever happened to him, his most important nest egg wouldn't be found in any bank. He turned, meeting Reynolds's eyes for a fraction of a second. Richard was a creature of habit. He had routines, places he frequented, some not officially sanctioned. Think about where a man like Richard Monroe, a man who trusted few and documented everything, would hide something truly vital, something he believed they wouldn't know about. With that, Sterling nodded curtly and walked away, leaving Reynolds amidst the towering shelves of forgotten secrets, his mind racing. Reynolds immediately relayed Sterling's information to Park. Ornithology, rare birds, a nest egg not in a bank. The pieces began to click into a new, disturbing pattern. The canary wasn't just a random word from a fractured mind. It was a deliberate clue, a breadcrumb left by the meticulous Richard Monroe. They focused again on Monroe's life, his habits outside of work. He was a bachelor, lived alone, few close friends outside the bureau. But Sterling's words, places he frequented, some not officially sanctioned, sparked an idea in Park. What about his hobbies, his routines? You said his apartment was meticulous. What if he had another space, something less official? This led them back to the mundane contents of the outer storage unit, the boxes labeled kitchen, books, personal. The FBI had inventoried them, of course, deemed them irrelevant. But Monroe was a man of layers, of hidden compartments, both literally and figuratively. His nest egg, Park said slowly, staring at the inventory list. What if the storage unit itself, the outer part, wasn't just a random choice by his abductors to build their room? What if Monroe chose that facility for a reason long before they ever targeted him? Reynolds frowned. But it was registered to a shell corporation, dissolved years ago. Exactly, Park countered. A perfect cutout, untraceable to him publicly. What if he rented it himself, under that guise, years before as a personal dead drop, a place to store his real sensitive files, the rare bird dossiers? And his captors, investigating him, found out about this shell corporation and its storage unit, assumed it was a current safe house or meeting point, and then built their interrogation room inside his pre-existing secret space. It was a chilling thought. Monroe, inadvertently leading his tormentors to his own sanctuary. The canary, then, wasn't something in the torture room. It was something Monroe believed was still hidden, something his captors, focused on breaking him for information they thought he carried in his head, wouldn't have looked for, or wouldn't have understood even if they stumbled upon it. Something related to his ornithology filing system. They revisited the journal, specifically the drawings of eyes. What if they weren't just eyes? Park, tracing one with her finger, noticed its peculiar, almost geometric pupil. This isn't an eye, Tom. Look at the precision. It's more like a lens, or a keyhole. Then Reynolds remembered the circular indentation on the shelf in the hidden room where the alarm clock had sat, and the clock itself frozen at 3:17. The clock wasn't just a clock, he said, a sudden urgency in his voice. It was marking something, or hiding something. What if the canary is a microdot, or a hidden reel of film, something small enough to be concealed within an ordinary object, or linked to a specific time? The time, 3:17, it seemed too specific to be random. Could it be a file number, a safe combination, a locker? Sterling's memory of Monroe mentioning an unexpected place where money and influence converge, combined with the ornithology clues and the physical evidence in the unit, began to paint a startling picture. Richard Monroe, the systematic agent, had created a fail-safe. He had anticipated the danger he was in. The canary was his final message, his legacy, and it was still out there, waiting to sing, if only they could find its cage. The system might be trying to silence Monroe's voice, but his echoes from the past were growing louder, guiding them toward a truth that promised to be explosive. The number 317, etched onto their minds from the frozen display of that desolate alarm clock, became an obsession for Detective Lisa Park and Agent Tom Reynolds. It was a phantom key they tried in countless imaginary locks, safe deposit indexes, street addresses, archival codes, each attempt yielding nothing but the dull thud of another dead end. Assistant Director Crofts pronounced skepticism, a thinly veiled warning against their unsanctioned deep dive, was a constant, chilling pressure. Each day that passed felt like a victory for the forces of inertia, or worse, for those who wanted Richard Monroe's secrets to remain buried with him. David Sterling's carefully dropped crumbs of information were their only real sustenance. His latest, delivered with studied nonchalance during a corridor crossing, concerned Monroe's almost ritualistic attachment to his old field kit. Richard clung to Constance, Sterling had murmured, his eyes scanning the hallway. That battered aluminum case, it wasn't just gear, it was an anchor, and that bird guide he always carried, Audubon's comprehensive 1958 special edition. He said the worn pages felt like home, strange comfort for a man hunting monsters. The specificity of the edition, 1958, resonated with Park. "The shelf in that room," she said to Reynolds later, the words tumbling out in her makeshift command center, her kitchen, the circular mark in the dust. It wasn't just any book. It was that book. I'd stake my badge on it. Monroe must have had it with him, perhaps his sole companion in that abyss, a link to a world of order and beauty amidst the calculated chaos designed to break him. Getting back into Unit 387, specifically to Monroe's archived personal effects in the outer storage area, was a high-wire act. Official channels were frozen solid. Reynolds, leveraging a sliver of bureaucratic ambiguity concerning potential contamination of secondary evidence perimeters, managed to secure himself and Park brief, monitored access. Their chaperone, Agent Miller, was young, ambitious, and radiated suspicion like a heat lamp. His eyes, unlike the indifferent gaze of their previous escort, missed nothing. While Reynolds engaged Miller in a deliberately convoluted discussion about forensic particulate patterns near the sealed entrance to the hidden chamber, Park moved with quiet urgency towards Box 7, labeled Miscellaneous Personal Effects. Her hands, usually steady, betrayed a slight tremor as she sliced the aged tape. The contents were a jumble: old camping equipment, a rusted toolkit, and then the books. Her fingers brushed against worn leather. Audubon's Comprehensive Guide to North American Birds, 1958 Special Edition. The embossed title was faded, the cover scarred, but it was unmistakably the one. Its dimensions were a perfect match for the ghostly imprint. With Miller momentarily distracted by Reynolds pointing out a non-existent anomaly on the floor, Park quickly opened the guide. A wave of musty paper and old ink hit her. She fanned the pages, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Between the brilliantly colored plates of finches and warblers, near the section on Cerinus canaria, the common canary, a single folded slip of paper lay nestled. It wasn't a note, not a map. It was a deposit receipt from Argent Secure Holdings, a fortress of discretion for the city's ultra-wealthy, dated the 17th of March, 1987, the day Monroe vanished, 3/17. The account identifier was stark, all 79, gold, the canary's treasure. It detailed the deposit of one standard-issue FBI attaché case, contents sealed. The access code, BWSG 1958, P317. Birdwatcher's Special Guide, Reynolds confirmed later, his voice tight with excitement when Park showed him the slip, far from listening ears. Page 317. They located a digital copy of the exact Audubon edition. Page 317 depicted the pine siskin, a resilient little bird. And there, in the margin, penned in Monroe's infinitesimally small, precise script, was a chilling annotation. Noctua nests high. Where the owl seeks shelter, eagles often share the eyrie. The greatest shadow is cast by the brightest light. Owls and eagles, Noctua, and the symbols of power, legitimacy. The implication was breathtaking. Monroe was pointing towards an enemy embedded not in the fringes, but potentially at the very heart of the establishment. This alone was a monumental breakthrough. But as Park examined the bird guide more closely later that night, an instinct honed by years of walking crime scenes screamed that there was more. The book itself felt, not tampered with, but prepared. She ran her fingers along the inside of the sturdy spine, pressing gently, a tiny, almost imperceptible irregularity. Using the fine point of a sewing needle borrowed from an old kit, she probed delicately. There was a click, a minute release of tension. A section of the spine covering, no bigger than her thumbnail, slid back to reveal a hollow cavity. Inside, glinting under her desk lamp, was a minuscule metal cylinder. A microdot reader was needed. Reynolds procured one from a forgotten corner of the FBI lab's older inventory. What they saw projected onto the stark white wall of Park's living room made the blood run cold. It was Monroe's handwriting again, digitized to an almost microscopic level. Argent case, all 79. Key, BWSG 1958, P317. Passphrase, Eleanor. Sterling had told them about Eleanor, Monroe's beloved, long-deceased mother, the emotional cornerstone of his life. It was a perfect, unbreakable passphrase, but the message on the microdot continued, and the next words shattered their brief moment of triumph. Eleanor's song is known to them. C gave the chorus. Trust no eagle who claims sanctuary. The canary is guarded, but the fox is in the coop. C, Park breathed, the single initial hanging in the air like a death sentence. Croft. Assistant Director Harrison Croft. Eleanor's song is known to them. Croft didn't just suspect, he knew the passphrase. He hadn't been slow, walking the investigation out of bureaucratic caution. He had been actively, malevolently, ensuring no one else got to Monroe's secrets before he did, or before those he represented did. The anonymous tip that led them to Unit 387. It wasn't from a guilt-ridden conspirator or a benevolent bystander. It was a calculated move. Someone knew Monroe had left a trail, too complex for a casual search, but solvable by dedicated investigators. Park and Reynolds were those investigators, bloodhounds set loose, intended to follow the scent, only to have their quarry snatched away at the last moment by Croft himself, or by Noctua, alerted by Croft. Monroe's final desperate scrawl in the journal, "They don't know about the canary," wasn't about the attaché case itself. It was a prayer that this final warning, this microdot hidden within the bird guide, his true last message about the depth of the betrayal, remained undiscovered by his captors, by CATT. The system wasn't just indifferent or self-protective, it was compromised at a terrifyingly high level. Richard Monroe hadn't just been fighting a shadowy criminal syndicate called Noctua. He had been battling a rot that had spread into the very marrow of the institution he'd sworn to serve. The eagles weren't just sharing an eyrie with the owl. Some of them were the owls, cloaked in feathers of authority. Park and Reynolds were no longer just solving a murder or a kidnapping. They were standing on the precipice of exposing a truth that could bring the whole edifice crashing down, with them buried in the rubble. The hunt for the canary's cage had just become infinitely more dangerous, because one of the chief hunters was the most lethal predator of all. The revelation that Assistant Director Harrison Croft was the C in Monroe's final damning message hit Park and Reynolds with the force of a physical blow. Croft wasn't just an obstructionist bureaucrat. He was a key player in the conspiracy, a wolf in eagle's clothing. He knew about Eleanor. He likely knew, or had facilitated access to, the contents of Monroe's attaché case at Argent Secure Holdings. The entire investigation they were supposedly leading was a charade, a carefully managed stage play designed to lead them to a predetermined, sanitized conclusion, or perhaps to identify and neutralize anyone who got too close to the real truth, Monroe's truth. The microdot's warning, "Trust no eagle who claims sanctuary. The canary is guarded, but the fox is in the coop," was a desperate plea from beyond the grave. Monroe knew his primary failsafe, the attaché case, might be compromised if his passphrase was tortured out of him. The bird guide, with its hidden microdot, was his contingency, his true last stand, meant for someone who would look deeper, someone like Sterling, or now, Park and Reynolds. Their options were perilously few. Going directly to the FBI director with accusations against Croft, armed only with a microdot and interpretations of a dead man's cryptic warnings, was a career-ending, if not life-ending, gamble. Croft was entrenched, powerful, and had the institutional weight to crush them. They needed more than just Monroe's words. They needed irrefutable proof of Croft's complicity and the nature of what was in that attaché case. If Croft knew the passphrase, Reynolds reasoned, his voice low and tense as they huddled in Park's apartment, the curtains drawn tight, he or his Noctua associates would have accessed that case years ago. So why the elaborate game now? Why lead us to the storage unit with the anonymous tip? Park stared at the projected image of Monroe's note from the microdot. Monroe wrote, "The canary is guarded," plural, not "I guarded the canary." What if he meant the contents of the case itself have a secondary safeguard? Something that even with physical access, Croft couldn't bypass without a specific key or piece of knowledge Monroe didn't reveal under torture. It was a sliver of hope. Monroe, the meticulous planner, might have anticipated even the failure of his passphrase. David Sterling was their only viable ally within the Bureau, but even he was under immense pressure. When they cautiously shared the microdot's contents with him, omitting, for now, the direct accusation against Croft by name but emphasizing the high-level betrayal, Sterling's already pale face became ashen. He didn't need the initial C spelled out. He understood. "Richard once told me," Sterling said, his voice barely a whisper, "that the most dangerous secrets are not those locked away, but those hidden in plain sight, protected by their own audacity." He was working on something, an algorithm, he called it, to trace illicit funds through legitimate channels. He believed Noctua wasn't just laundering money, but weaponizing it, influencing policy, elections, justice itself. The attaché case, it likely contains the raw data, the blueprint of that algorithm, and the primary targets he'd identified. If this data was still intact, it was dynamite. Their plan was desperate, bordering on reckless. They couldn't storm Argent Secure Holdings, but Reynolds, through his old financial crimes contact, learned of a rarely used emergency protocol at Argent. In the event of suspected owner incapacitation or death, and with specific legal triggers, which they didn't have, a designated third party could request a contents audit performed by Argent's internal security under extreme scrutiny. It was a long shot. Their only leverage was the public nature of Richard Monroe's disappearance, and now, the discovery of his torture. They decided to leak, carefully and anonymously, not the existence of the attaché case, but the fact of the microdot's discovery and its accusation of a high-level FBI betrayal in Monroe's death. Omitting Croft's initial for now but hinting at a cover-up, they routed it through a trusted investigative journalist Park knew, someone with a reputation for tenacity and discretion. The resulting article, published online by a small but fiercely independent news outlet, was a bombshell. It didn't name Croft, but it spoke of senior elements within federal law enforcement actively suppressing the truth about Agent Monroe's investigation into a shadowy syndicate and his subsequent murder. It mentioned newly discovered cryptographic evidence left by Monroe himself. The public and internal FBI outcry was immediate and intense. The director, already under scrutiny, could no longer ignore the mounting pressure. He announced a full, independent internal affairs review, headed by an outside counsel. Croft, while not publicly named in the initial leak, was suddenly under a very bright, very uncomfortable spotlight. He couldn't quash this. This was the opening Park and Reynolds needed. With the IA investigation now a reality, they, along with Sterling, who courageously stepped forward, risking his career, presented their full findings, including the microdot and its direct reference to C, to the independent counsel. They highlighted the Argent Secure Holdings deposit slip and Monroe's annotation about Eagles. The independent counsel, a former federal judge with an unimpeachable reputation, moved swiftly. Armed with the authority of the review, she was able to compel Argent Secure Holdings to confirm the existence of account AU-79 and its access history. The records showed no access since Monroe's original deposit in 1987. Park's hunch had been right. Monroe's canary was indeed still guarded. Either Croft hadn't been certain enough of the Eleanor passphrase to risk a failed attempt at such a sensitive vault, or Monroe's secondary safeguard, perhaps linked to the algorithm itself, had prevented access to the usable data, even if the case had been physically opened. The counsel, using the full weight of her authority, and citing the ongoing murder investigation of a federal agent and matters of national security, finally secured a warrant to open Monroe's attaché case. In the sterile viewing room at Argent, with Park, Reynolds, Sterling, and the counsel present, the locks on the old FBI attaché case were drilled. Inside, there were no bundles of cash, no incriminating photographs in the traditional sense. Instead, there were meticulously organized ledger books, several encrypted data drives, and a handwritten key to Monroe's financial algorithm. And a single final note from Richard Monroe, addressed to whomever finds this, if justice still has a voice. The note detailed how his algorithm was designed to expose Noctua's vast network, implicating figures not just in business and organized crime, but high within the political sphere and, chillingly, within federal law enforcement itself. Harrison Croft was named explicitly, not just as a collaborator, but as a key node in Noctua's network of influence within the FBI, their eagle in the eyrie. Monroe explained that the data on the drives was further encrypted with a sequence tied to a constantly changing astronomical variable, the key to which he had only ever committed to memory, and a separate, more deeply hidden location, a true dead man's switch that Croft could never have known. The canary had sung, and its song was devastating. The fallout was catastrophic for Noctua and its protectors. Harrison Croft was arrested, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The independent counsel's report, drawing heavily on Monroe's data, led to a cascade of arrests, resignations, and indictments that reached into the highest echelons of power. It was a purge, brutal and necessary. The eagles Monroe had warned about scattered, their nests exposed. For Park and Reynolds, there was a quiet vindication. They had faced down the system and, with Monroe's ghostly guidance, had forced it to confront its own corruption. Sterling, for his courage, was tasked with helping rebuild the shattered trust within the Bureau. The ending was not entirely neat. Noctua, as an entity, was too amorphous, too deeply embedded to be completely eradicated overnight. Its tendrils would likely regrow, but its heart, the one Monroe had pinpointed, had been dealt a crippling blow. In the aftermath, Park found herself by Richard Monroe's newly placed official gravestone, a simple marble marker replacing the anonymous plot where his mother lay. The inscription read, Richard M. Monroe, Special Agent, FBI. He sought truth in darkness. Beside his name, someone, perhaps Sterling, perhaps another anonymous admirer of his quiet courage, had placed a small porcelain canary. It stood as a silent testament to a man who, even in death, had found a way to make his voice heard, ensuring that the shadows, no matter how powerful, could not entirely extinguish the light. The fight for justice, Monroe knew, was eternal, a constant vigilance against the owls and the compromised eagles, a song that had to be sung again and again.